We had this conversation before the show. Who is the most influential white athlete of all time?
In the chat, I need your answer. I will. Yeah, I need your answer. In the chat, I need your answer.
Answer. Any sport. Not football, not exclusively football, not exclusively basketball. Who is the most influential white athlete?
While we're waiting for
Caitlin Clark.
Oh, she like 3. So she like, yeah, she top 3.
Wow. We put
She might be 2. No, she's 1.
Oh.
She's 1.
Damn, that
Well,
question.
what I'm saying,
Caitlin Clark, the most influential white athlete in all of history.
She's a boy. Any out of you white? Someone just called Caitlin Clark the most influential white athlete of all time in a room full of people who were not exactly her biggest fans going into the conversation. And by the end of it, nobody could argue back with any real evidence. The debate started with Larry Bird and David Beckham. It ended in one place. Here is how it got there.
Serena was great for us. She was great.
The greatest.
Who was watching women's basketball? Think about what we're talking about, though.
Nobody.
Yo, you wasn't. You wasn't. He wasn't. Nobody's watching girls basketball. And then we get this girl like Steph Curry. Everybody watching. To this day.
To this day.
To this day. Women's basketball is looked at like the NBA, like the NFL.
Who do you think is the most influential white athlete of all time? And does Caitlin Clark belong in that conversation or above it? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Let's start with the question itself, because it is more interesting than it sounds on the surface. Most influential white athlete of all time, any sport, and the conversation that followed went through Larry Bird, Michael Phelps, David Beckham, Conor McGregor, Tony Hawk, and eventually landed on Caitlin Clark. Not because someone was trying to make a point about race, but because when you actually apply the criteria, influence, cultural reach, change to behavior, move the needle, one name kept winning every round of the argument.
Now you see, there's blocks where they're going to talk about Luka and they're going to talk about Caitlin Clark.
True.
Hey.
Think about it. I like
Shady's
this point. Last point. The girl that should play at like, I don't know, LSU or USC.
Yep.
She played at Iowa.
Yeah.
Y'all tripping. Caitlin Clark.
The problem is this.
It's so too far. Serena Williams. Let's go through the candidates first, because the elimination process is actually the most entertaining part. Michael Phelps came up early, and the pushback was immediate and completely valid. Phelps is the most decorated Olympian in history, 23 gold medals. A swimmer so dominant that his very existence redefined what the human body was supposed to be capable of in the water. But did he make you want to swim? Did he have kids across the country begging their parents for pool memberships? The answer, honestly, is no, and the reason is infrastructure. Swimming requires a pool. Not everyone has one. Not everyone is going to a public pool. The barrier to entry for swimming is high enough that even the greatest swimmer who ever lived could not fully convert his dominance into widespread participation growth. Phelps was massive. His influence had real limits. That's it. Some of them are in Ireland. Some of them are in Scotland.
Athlete though, point blank period, is David Beckham. They were not bended like Beckham. You know that, and you never watched a game of soccer in your entire life. Like that. Like he's got stupid.
You don't think David Beckham?
Bro, David Beckham was like.
I don't think so. I'm not saying he's a great guy. He's a great dude and looks nice. He got magazines. I'm cool with all that.
Who wants to play Larry Bird though? Not Larry Bird, but I like nobody. David Beckham got a serious argument, and the person making it had a point. You could not watch a game of soccer in your entire life and still know who David Beckham was. Bend it like Beckham as a cultural reference. The hairstyles, the fashion, the relationship with Victoria, the crossover into pop culture that made him as visible in a magazine as on a pitch. Beckham was genuinely one of the most globally recognizable athletes of his era, across demographics that had never watched a single 90-minute match. That is real influence, but the counter-argument is also real. Beckham's influence in the United States specifically, and influence in America, tends to dominate these conversations because of the sheer size of the market, was more about celebrity than sport. He moved to LA, played for the Galaxy, and soccer still did not become a major American sport during his tenure there. He was a cultural figure. His influence on the game of soccer in the American market was more limited than his general fame suggested. Larry Bird came up multiple times, and the argument was always about basketball credibility. Bird is one of the greatest players in NBA history. 3 championships, 3 MVPs, 12 All-Star appearances. The rival with Magic Johnson that is widely credited with saving the NBA in the 1980s. His influence on the sport is undeniable at the professional level. But as one person in the conversation noted, nobody was running around saying they wanted to be like Larry. He was admired, he was feared by opponents, he was respected by everyone who watched him play. But the generation of kids who grew up wanting to play basketball the way Larry Bird played it is not as identifiable as the generation of kids who grew up wanting to be Michael Jordan. Bird influenced the sport. He did not necessarily change who was in the sport. Conor McGregor got real support in the room, and for a specific reason. His swagger crossed racial and cultural lines in a way that very few white athletes have managed. The trash talk, the confidence, the personality that made you watch even if you had never watched MMA in your life. People who had zero interest in mixed martial arts were watching Conor McGregor press conferences because he was simply one of the most entertaining people to ever hold a microphone. The Irish working class background delivered with the energy of someone who had fully convinced themselves they were royalty. It connected with people across demographics in a way that was genuinely unusual. The problem with McGregor as the answer is that his influence, while significant, is concentrated in a specific window of time and a specific cultural lane. He made MMA bigger. He did not change the entire sporting ecosystem around him. Tony Hawk was the answer the chat produced, and the room eventually agreed it was underrated, because Tony Hawk did something that most people do not fully appreciate. He took skateboarding from a subculture that mainstream America largely ignored and made it something that little kids in suburbs and cities and everywhere in between were desperate to be part of. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater as a video game franchise alone introduced an entire generation to skate culture who would never have encountered it otherwise. Lil Wayne's mid-2000 aesthetic, the skinny jeans, the skate influence on hip-hop fashion, there is a direct line from Tony Hawk to all of it. Even if people do not always trace it back that far, you know who Tony Hawk is. Even if you have never watched him skate, that is influence. But then Caitlin Clark entered the conversation, and the person who made the argument did it simply. No charts, no prepared statistics. Just a question: who is watching women's basketball right now compared to 5 years ago? The answer is everyone, or at least everyone compared to before. And the follow-up question was, why? One name, one player from Iowa who plays like Steph Curry and handles the ball like she invented the step-back three, who came into the WNBA and immediately made every arena she played and sell out, not just for the Indiana Fever, but the road games. The visiting team started selling out because she was coming to town. The WNBA had to navigate the entirely new problem of managing enormous crowds at venues that had never had to think about crowd management before. The viewership numbers told the same story in a different format. When Clark played, people watched. When she went down with an injury last season, viewership dropped by approximately 50%. Not just for the Fever, not just for her games, but across the entire league. One player, 50% drop. When she was out and the league was still drawing better numbers than it historically had, it was partly because the infrastructure of attention she built did not disappear just because she was not on the court. The WNBA turned a profit for the first time in its history. The CBA negotiation produced the biggest pay increases the league has ever seen. New television deals happened. New broadcast blocks exist on ESPN, where women's basketball gets real dedicated airtime that it never had before. Unrivaled launched as an off-season league with actual audiences and actual investment because there were suddenly enough women's basketball fans to make that viable. And Caitlin Clark played 13 games in the season where a lot of this happened. 13 games before the injury. The foundation she built in less than 2 full seasons was strong enough that the league's growth continued even in her absence. The Serena Williams comparison came up, and it was the most interesting part of the whole conversation because both sides were right about different things. Serena Williams was the sport. That is not hyperbole. She was women's tennis in a way that no one before or after has matched. Her dominance was so complete, so sustained across so many years that her opponents became famous partly by virtue of being on the other side of the net from her. Naomi Osaka cried on a court after beating her. The emotional weight of competing against Serena was so significant that winning could feel like losing if you handled it wrong. Coco Gauff's career trajectory was shaped in part by who Serena was to her growing up. The legacy of Serena Williams inside women's tennis is probably unmatched by any athlete in any sport. The children of her influence are still playing professional tennis. But, and this is the part that made the conversation genuinely compelling, the sport she transformed was tennis, a sport that the average American watches during the Grand Slams and mostly ignores in between. A sport where even at Serena's absolute peak, if you asked a random person on the street to name 3 women's tennis players other than Serena, the silence would have been loud. The argument for Clark is not that she is better than Serena. The argument is that what she did to a sport that was already in the American consciousness, already on American television, already something people had a framework for caring about, and she made them care about the women's version of it in a way they never had before. You can name more women's basketball players right now than you could 5 years ago. Not because the players got better, though they did. Because one player came along and made you want to know who was on the court with her and who she was playing against. Kelsey Mitchell, Aaliyah Boston, Angel Reese, Breanna Stewart. Names that casual sports fans know now who had never heard of them before. Clark arrived. The rising tide lifting all boats is real, and the boat that lifted everything was one person. The Angel Reese dynamic is worth addressing directly because it came up in the conversation, and it is always a complicated one. Reese and Clark going into the 2023 NCAA championship game was the moment that cracked open the ceiling on women's college basketball viewership. That game was the most watched women's college basketball championship in history at that point. The rivalry was real, the personalities were real, and the combination of them drew an audience that neither player alone would have produced. That is genuinely true, but the distinction the conversation drew is also fair. Clark was already built into a superstar before that matchup. She had already been doing things on a basketball court. Step back threes from half court, full court passes, handles that made you stop scrolling, that made people who had never cared about women's basketball say who was that. The South Carolina game before the rivalry with Reese became a cultural moment showed it. Big, strong, athletic defenders trying to stop a player who plays like she does, not notice how big they are, and hitting threes from distances that should not be legal. The race element of the conversation got addressed honestly and without much drama. The point was made that Clark being white in a predominantly black sport gave the story a specific cultural texture that made it more visible to audiences who might not have otherwise engaged. Magic needed Bird, and Bird needed Magic. The NBA's revival in the 80s was not just about individual excellence. It was about a rivalry that gave the sport a narrative structure that drew in people who needed a reason to choose sides. Clark's presence in the WNBA created a similar dynamic, whether anyone was comfortable saying it or not. But the same people making that observation were also the ones saying that when you are a real athlete, color stops mattering. The game is the game, and Clark's game, the handles, the shooting range, the vision, the refusal to be physical intimidated by anyone, is what holds up when you strip everything else away. She could be any background from any place, and the basketball itself would still be something worth watching. The final answer the conversation landed on was not delivered as a proclamation. It was delivered as an observation that nobody in the room pushed back on. Caitlin Clark got the WNBA, a new CBA. She got them a television deal. She got them profit for the first time in league history. She made people who had never watched women's basketball know the names of players they had never heard of. She did all of this while still being in the early part of a professional career that has not yet produced a championship or a scoring title or any of the hardware that usually defines a legacy. Tony Hawk is a great answer for the most influential white athlete conversation. Conor McGregor made a strong case. David Beckham had his moments. Larry Bird changed the NBA. But if the question is who changed the most in the surrounding ecosystem, who made a league profitable, a sport mainstream, a demographic of sports fans exist where they did not exist before and kept doing it even when they were not playing. The conversation ended somewhere very specific, and it was not Bird, it was not Beckham, it was not Hawk. The debate started with Larry Bird and ended with Caitlin Clark. And by the time the room got there, nobody had a real counter-argument left. Whether you think she has already earned that title or still needs more time to prove it, the conversation is happening whether the WNBA is ready for it or not. Hit like, drop your take below, and subscribe so you never miss a video.